Hey everyone, and welcome back to JavaScript in Metaphors. Today's topic is going to be on functions, and we are going to look at functions from a conceptual point of view, and then look at how we've used it in our chat application. So, I thought about what's a good way to explain a function, and what I came up with was actually looking at the stove in the kitchen. So if you think about it, whenever you have to cook a meal and you want the meal to be warm, you use the stove in your kitchen. And the way it works is you go over to the stove, you push the button, you start generating heat into the surface of the stove. You know how to make food. What am I talking about? Anyway, what's abstracted away from you is all of the details that goes into making the surface hot. So you push the button and then everything that happens, all the electrical wiring inside of the stove, that's hidden away from you. So you don't interact with that directly. And in fact, you don't even need to know how it works. All you need to know is the interface or how you interact with the stove. So you press the button, and the function is that the surface becomes warm, right? So that's the interface. You press the button and the function is that the surface becomes warm. And then all the details of that is just hidden away and you don't need to know them. And let's take a look at what would happen if you didn't have a stove. Why would you need a function? Why do you need a stove? Well, say you want to make dinner again and you don't have a stove. Now, what would you do? Well, you could go out and gather wood and create a fire and wait for the fire to get warm enough to put a pan on and then heat the pan that way. But it's going to be a tedious and long operation every time. And it's something you'd have to kind of do again and again and again and again every single day. So the functionality or the function of the stove solves a pain problem for you. And it does it in a way that you don't have to think about it. It just works. So let's go ahead and look a little bit about functions in terms of code. All right, so now we're back in Code Sandbox, and we're going to take a look at functions from the code point of view. So first, we'll start by creating a function, and then we'll examine it afterwards. So we do that by using the function keyword and giving it a label. Now, the label is very similar to how a variable works. It's how we're going to refer to this function later. So it means in the label hello, we're going to store a function. Now, we need a few more pieces. The first being parens behind the label. And then we need a couple of curly brackets. So this is the syntax for creating a function. And inside of the curly brackets here, we are going to put the code that we want to run when we use this function. So for now, we're going to do console log hello. And nothing is really happening right now, as we would expect, because we have only defined the function here. We aren't actually using it anywhere. So in order to use it, we need to refer to the label that we created here, and we need to invoke it by adding parens at the end. So if we do that, down here in the console, you can see that we're logging out hello. Not Halo, which is a video game, I believe, but hello. So if we add to this, we'll see that we can update the console message right here. Now let's try to do something a little bit more interesting. So we'll add a parameter to this function. Now a parameter is an entity that the function will accept and that the function within its own body can use. So let's go ahead and console log name. And it's going to be undefined. And why is that? Well, it's because we've defined a parameter here. And the parameter defines the expectation of a value. So what that means is that this function expects to receive a argument, which is the counterpart to a parameter, called name. So it's just a technical description, but inside of the function, when you define it, what you put here is known as parameters. When you are calling the function and you are supplying arguments like my name, this here is known as an argument, and it's the counterpart of the parameter. The parameter is what you use when you define the function, and the argument is the value that you actually send in when you call the function. So it's just a technical division there. But you can see that if we put a value here, and in this case the value is a string, you can see that we log that out here. Now what we can do is we can use that value in our console log. And if we put the name here, we're going to be able to use it inside of our function and log it out together with the hello. Now we can go ahead and call the function again and give it a different name. And you'll see that we're able to perform the exact same functionality, but provide different arguments, and we'll get a different result. The work will be the same, but the result will be different. And that means that if we had a lot of work done in this function, we'd only have to write it once in our program, and we could reuse it anywhere, which is really powerful. And it comes back to a principle called dry, which means don't repeat yourself. And it's a good practice in programming to write as little code as possible, because every line of code that you write is going to be a liability, because it's something you need to maintain and something you need to actively have a relationship with for the lifetime of your code base. So what we want to do is we want to write as little code as possible, and functions are a great way to do that because we can encapsulate the logic and give them meaningful names. And then if we have to change the logic, we only have to do it in one place. We don't have a lot of different places around our code where we have to go in and make changes if we have done a good job dividing our functionality into functions. Now, I always feel that doing trivial examples like this don't always bring home the point. So I want us to switch over to our chat application and take a look at how it's being used there. All right, so here we are in our messages.js file, and we have a function here called create main content. Now, don't be scared because this function looks a little bit different from what we did before. If you remember, we had a function hello, which looked like this. And it's exactly the same. We could have written this function as function create main content in the same way. And for all intents and purposes, it would be equivalent. There are some nuances to using this syntax right here, which we'll dive into later. But for now, just know that this way of creating a function works just as well. So if we, just to show you how we could have rewritten this hello function, it would look something like this. So we'll define a variable called hello, and it's going to equal whatever's on the right-hand side here. And what we'll do is we'll give an arrow function, which is another syntax of creating a function, and then we'd put our console log in there. So that would be exactly the same. But we're not going to look too closely on this now because that's not the point of this lesson. What I want to focus on is the content of this function here. And you can see that what we're doing here is actually wrapping this entire functionality here in the function, which means that we can call this function without any parameters or arguments, and it's going to create everything that's inside here. And if you want to know what that is, basically it's this section right here that renders out all of these chat messages. And that's quite handy for us, because if we go back and look at the code, we can see that we have a current chat selected. So the current chat is the messages for the currently selected user. So if we take a look at our application again, we are currently having a chat with Chris. So this is our current chat, and we are using the dataset to render out these messages. So if you remember, we have a messages array. We can go quickly to our dataset, and the messages are down here, and they have an ID, and we're using the ID to get these messages out, and then we're rendering them out to the screen like we did when we created this application in the first place. Now, the function here is responsible for rendering the content to the screen. And you can see we have a couple of other functions here as well. If we disregard this first one, which is something we're going to talk about shortly, and focus on the ones that we've defined, which is create contact message, create user message. Let's go ahead and go into create contact message and see what this looks like. All right. So this is the code for creating a contact message. And we're doing a fair amount of work here. We're creating a container, we're getting the contact ID, we're creating an image and giving it a source, an alt, and we're adding a class to it. So once all that is done, we're returning the entire container. So if we didn't have this function to create this for us, what would we have to do? Well, we'd have to take all of this code here, and we would have to copy it and go over to our create contact message, our messages, go up here, and then we would have to put all of that code in here as well. And you could argue that that works as well, but it's going to make this function quite long. And usually, my rule of thumb is if you can extract something into a function to make it more readable, you do it. If you can extract the function out in order to make it more reusable, if the code is used in more places, you do it. And it has a cost, a small cost, to incur a function call. But as long as you don't have a performance problem, extract it into a function if it feels right to you. In this case, it feels right because this function, it's already quite long. And you want to be able to read a function and look at it and see what's going on. So in here, you can see that we are using this for each method, which we'll talk about when we get to arrays. And for each message, you can think about it like this. We're going over each message in the list of messages, and we're checking, is the message owner the current user? And if it is, if that's a match, then we're creating a contact message, which we can easily read here because the function has an appropriate label. And then if it's not the current user, then we're going to create a user message. So the functions here, even though they're not technically used in many different locations, they are helping to give a more readable interface to this function right here. You can also see that in the create contact message and create user message functions, we are passing the message here as an argument. And the message consists of the content, which is a string, a timestamp, and an owner. So let's go ahead and go into one of these functions here and see what happens. So the message is being accepted here as the parameter. And that means that once we invoke it, we get access to the message that was passed in. So we know that a message has an ID, an owner, and content. So you can see that we are getting the owner here, and we're getting the content. And then we are using that in order to get the contact. So if you remember back, we separated the messages and the contacts into different data structures. So in order to get the contact, we have to use the ID because that's the link between them. And once we have it, we are using that to create the image down here. You can see that it's quite dynamic. You can pass anything into a function as an argument. Even other functions, which we'll see in a later video, which is quite interesting and gives a whole lot of flexibility in how you can work with JavaScript. So I think that's it for functions. Thanks for tuning in, and we're going to go deeper into these concepts later, but for now I think this is a good baseline to get started with. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe if you're getting something out of these videos. It helps me massively and it keeps you updated on the latest content. So thank you for tuning in again, and I'll see you in the next video.